Morning and welcome to our Zoom worship service. I'm Karen Jennings and I'm the celebrant for this morning's service. We preface our service by acknowledging that the land on which our homes and our church were built was not uninhabited when European settlers arrived here with their ideas of conquest and ownership. For those of us who live in Moscow, Pullman, or other nearby communities, we live on the ancestral homelands of the Nimipu, called Nez Perce by the French-speaking traders, the Palouse, and the Sichuans, called the Coeur d'Alene. If you are joining us from another place, I encourage you to discover who inhabited or who moved through the place where you live in the times before colonization and genocide and where they are now. We pause and remember that we live on ground that is sacred, ground that was stolen, ground that cries out for justice and for responsible stewardship. May our remembering help us find the courage to do our part to restore wholeness to the earth and all her peoples. We are also going to light a candle for peace in Ukraine and everywhere, acknowledging that the imperialist mindset continues to threaten people and our precious planet. And now let's join our voices together for our words of welcome, Eunice chalice lighting, and sung affirmation. Welcome to you, old friends and new, young and old. You are an essential part of our celebration today. Whether today is your first or your 1000th Sunday in our midst, we are stronger because you are with us. We are one people of many beliefs, identities, origins, sexualities, and genders. We are all growing, all learning, all loved. Body, mind, heart, and spirit, just as you are welcome here. We are hoping that everyone here has a chalice or a candle to light and something to light it with. Let's light our chalices together with these words from Octavia Butler. In order to rise from its own ashes, a phoenix first must burn.
Good morning, I'm Pam Arbor Green. Will you please join with me as we say the words to light our chalice? In the light of truth and the warmth of love, we gather to seek and we seek to share.
Good morning, everyone. I am delighted to introduce to you my friend and colleague, the Reverend Cindy Landrum. Cindy serves at the First Parish Church of Stowe and Acton in Stowe, Massachusetts. She is the niece of Reverend Jim Bob, which is why we are lucky enough to have her with us here in person today. And with that, take it away, Cindy.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Our opening words are by Gretchen Haley. There is too much beauty in this world to give up on it yet, and it is always too soon to surrender to cynicism. Bring your doubt, your skepticism, your downright confusion, even your bitterness. But in the midst of these, in the center, wrap your tender fingers around that still bright thread of hope. Feel in your heart that still steady hunger for something more. The vision we glimpse every day in the rising sun, across the foothills, the light that spreads across the face of the one we love, the look of knowing all there is to know and still loving life, loving us just as it is, just as we are. For this hour, we come to celebrate, to praise, to give thanks, to refuse to give up, to steady ourselves, keepers of hope, brave builders of this still possible world. Come, let us worship together.
Okay.
Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Mystery, mystery. Life is a riddle and a mystery. Mystery, mystery. Life is a riddle and a mystery. Where do we come from? Where are we going? Where do we come from? Where are we going? Where do we come from? Where are we going? Where do we come from? Where are we going?
Now let's take a moment to engage in the practice of generosity together. For those of you able to make a financial contribution, the logistics are on your screen. We'd invite you to either copy down the information you need or simply go to the website to make a donation. The web address is in the chat. Those of you who are newer or visiting from another part of the country may not be aware that we typically give away all of the cash from our Sunday offering to local charities whose mission align with our values, a program called the Month of Sundays. This month, the recipient is Weekend Food for Kids, a program started by UUCP and St. Mark's to provide extra food to families that take advantage of the summer lunch program. The bag of food they receive each Friday gets them through the weekend. If you are donating online, you can choose Month of Sundays from the drop-down menu. If you are mailing or dropping off a check, simply indicate in the memo line whether it's intended for the Month of Sundays or our general fund. In the spirit of love and for the continuing work of this church, we will now take some time to practice generosity together.
Do
Our words for private prayer or meditation are titled How to Survive the Apocalypse by the Reverend Sean Parker Dennison. First, learn to listen, not only for enemies around, corners in hidden places, but for the faint footsteps of hope and the whisper of resistance. Hone your skills, aim your heart towards kindness, and stockpile second chances. Under the weight of destruction, we will need the strong shelter of forgiveness and the deeper wells that give the sweet water of welcome. We have a place for you. When the world ends, we must not add destruction to destruction, not accept a beggar's bargain to fight death with more death. In order to survive the apocalypse, any apocalypse at all, we have to give up the counterfeit currency of self-sufficiency, the mistaken addiction to competition, the lie that the last to die has somehow survived. Blessed be. Amen. Ashe. Our readings today are two excerpts from Octavia Butler's books, The Parable of the Sower and The Parable of the Talents. The first, create no images of God, except the images that God has provided. They are everywhere, in everything. God is change. Seed to tree, tree to forest, rain to river, river to sea, grubs to bees, bees to swarm. From one, many. From many, one. Forever uniting, growing, dissolving, forever changing. The universe is God's self-portrait. And the second reading. We do not worship God. We perceive and attend God. We learn from God. With forethought and work, we shape God. In the end, we yield to God. We adapt and endure, for we are earth seed, and God is change. So, good morning. It is good to be here with you. I'm delighted to preach for you again today. I think I did once before, but it's been many years. And it feels like forever since I've been out here to the Palouse, given all that we've been through in the last 2 years. Today I'm going to be talking about dystopian novels and the hope, which might be surprising, that I find in them and how it's relevant for today. I've been joking with my congregation all through the pandemic that the good news for them is that I am an expert on dystopia and apocalypse. By expert, quote unquote, what I mean is that I've read dozens of dystopian novels. I published an article in the UU World on the Hunger Games, and I wrote something like a 30-page paper a few years ago on dystopian novels and film. It was the year Trump was elected that I wrote that paper, and it felt very appropriate at the time to be discovering and exploring the worlds of dystopias. But even indeed, does it feel more appropriate now and in the last couple of years? During the beginning of the pandemic, it was very common to hear people making jokes about the apocalypse, killer bees, pandemics. Whatever came up next, folks on Facebook would say, I did not have this on my apocalypse bingo. The song for the year, it felt like in 2020, was REM's It's the End of the World as We Know It. But I think the things I've learned from this genre are even more appropriate now than they were in 2020 as we come out of that time and face the future. And so even though we're now finding our way out of the dystopia that we've been in, I wanted to talk now about what the hope is that I find in dystopian literature and why I feel it's still worth turning to right now. So, Warning, there are spoilers here. The biggest spoiler, I'm going to tell you right now, is that the world does not end. Humanity is still essentially good. Freedom prevails. Love wins. God is not dead. And hope springs eternal. So, the reason I find this genre so powerful is that dystopias are about our literature holding out, examining, and confronting our greatest societal fears. So if you think about The Handmaid's Tale, Margaret Atwood's famous novel now turned into like a Hulu ongoing series, it reflects our still present and relevant fear of losing our reproductive freedom. Cultural critic Tom Moylan has described the purpose of dystopias as being to, quote, map, warn, and hope. So mapping and warning just means that these dystopian novels are pointing to problems in our society and where they can lead. That's less relevant perhaps in our current setting. We've seen the warnings and we're on the map. But what's relevant in our current situation is how they point towards hope. Annette Magid, in an article on dystopia, sees hope as intrinsic and says that the nature of dystopian novels is to suggest that this is not the end of everything by the fact that the novel keeps going. Quoting James Berger, she notes, quote, "The end is never the end. The apocalyptic text announces and describes the end of the world, but then the text does not end. Nor does the world represented in the text, and neither does the world itself. Something remains after the end." So just as many romance novels end with an epilogue in which there's a pregnancy announcement or there are little children running about, dystopias will often end with an epilogue showing that the world is good again after the end. And this is where we're getting to right now in our lives as we come out of the dystopia. We're coming to this end of pandemic and we will emerge out on the other side. So close your ears right now if you don't want Hunger Games spoilers. The Hunger Games series ends with Katniss journaling about how good things are now and how while they haven't forgotten, her children are growing up in a better time. And Handmaid's Tale? The Handmaid's Tale ends with academics in a further future speculating as to whether the journals of the dystopian world are to even be believed or not. In Station 11, the character of Clark muses at the end. He says this: he has no expectation of seeing an airplane arise again in his lifetime. But is it possible that somewhere there are ships setting out? If there are again towns with streetlights, if there are symphonies and newspapers, then what else might this awakening world contain? Perhaps vessels are setting out even now, traveling towards or away from him, attained by sailors armed with maps and knowledge of stars, driven by need or perhaps simply by curiosity. Whatever became of countries on the other side? Beyond just the idea that there's always something more, that there's hope, these novels also state something more, that in the most desperate hours of despair, in the most apocalyptic world we can imagine, there is still meaning. Station 11 is one of my favorite dystopias this way. In it, a fast-moving, deadly pandemic has wiped out most of humanity, and with it, most of the trappings of civilization. But the story focuses on a traveling troupe of musicians and actors as they bring their symphony and theater from town to town. The side of their caravan states, in a motto taken from a Star Trek episode, because mere survival is insufficient. Because survival is insufficient. And indeed, mere survival is not all that we are struggling for in this time. We are looking for art, for beauty, for meaning. That's why we keep coming to church through the whole pandemic, after all, isn't it? Lisa Rowe Faustino, author of The Hole in the Wall, explains how dystopias give us this hope and meaning, saying this: protagonists like Harry Potter and Katniss Everdeen may find it more challenging than Ponyboy Curtis in The Outsiders did to stay gold, to hold on to his goodness, not to become jaded. but that's still the ultimate goal of young adult fiction, and I think the source of hunger for dystopian fantasy in a decade dominated by global fears of war, terrorism, climate change, economic hardship, class divides, and a generally uncertain future for many. Faustino continues, no different from that quintessential literary adolescent Holden Caulfield, we want to hold on to the joy in life we felt as children. We want to hold on to our individuality, our humanity, our ability to love and to connect with others. We have always wanted to hold on, but in today's global communications network, we can't avoid facing overwhelming obstacles. The more we understand about how small and powerless we really are against the immense forces that control our existence, the more we yearn to feel meaningful. End quote. So dystopias teach us that even in the worst possible state, even in the cacistocracies of life, we can stay gold. In the Hunger Games, the character of Peeta says, in one of my favorite quotes, only I keep wishing that I could think of a way to show the capital that they don't own me, that I'm more than just a piece in their games. In the midst of a world where children are trained and required to kill each other, he tries to stay gold. He tries to hold on to himself, to stay true to himself. In this world that we're in, with everything changing, where the pandemic is still having devastating and deadly effects on individual lives and on whole communities, I know this too well, as we celebrated someone I loved yesterday whose death was affected by COVID. In the midst of this shifting world we live in, I find hope and meaning in dystopias, but one in particular, and that is Octavia Butler's The Parable of the Sower. It's been important to me for years, but particularly important now. Of all dystopian novels, Octavia Butler's The Parable of the Sower has the most to say to me about the meaning of life. It talks about it in the language of God, and it says that God is change. And for me, as an agnostic humanist, I don't have to understand the word God the way everyone does, but it still means something to me to say, God is change. In The Parable of the Sower, Butler tells the story of a young woman, Lauren Olamina, who is living in a future United States where gated communities are trying to hold together small remnants of society in a country where climate change has devastated the world, large corporations, indenture workers, and roving bands of drugged people lay waste to whoever and whatever they find outside the walls of safety. It is not actually all that unlike the world we live in today. And in the midst of that conflict, with their homes destroyed, people go walking northward in search of a better life. In Octavia Butler's world, they're heading north from Southern California, up towards here, maybe. Up towards here where they hope to find peaceful and sustainable lives. In our world, the migrations aren't starting so much within our borders as outside of them in places with more conflict, but we still see people migrating, searching for coming northward in search of a better life. In the sequel book, The Parable of the Talents, we learn that this dystopian country is in the midst of a presidential race. And one of the candidates is Andrew Steele Jarrett, a charismatic preacher with violent followers. Quote, Jarrett's people have been known to beat or drive out Unitarians for goodness sake, Lauren L. Olamina tells us. Note, this book was published in 1998, not recently. Jarrett, she says, quote, condemns the burnings, but does so in such mild language that his people are free to hear what they want to hear. Jarrett asks people to join him and, quote, help us make America great again. It was a book that felt particularly relevant during the Trump years, but it's still valid now as we climb out of that dystopian world he created and face a future where his strength is rising still and may rise again. In Octavia Butler's work, the corrupt politician's message, his theological message, is that America is great when might is what makes right, when violence is a sign of strength and when a government veers to fascism. We have many people in our country, many people around here perhaps, who believe that today. And that message of an America, one that we have seen so recently and is the one we are still struggling to emerge from. That message in the books is countered by the heroine, Lauren Olamina, and her theology and how she demonstrates it. When her town is destroyed by gangs, Olamina, the daughter of a preacher herself, takes to the road, heads north, where she hopes to create a community of religious followers for the new religion she feels she has discovered. Her community, called Earth Seed, will practice collective living, farming, teach their young, strive to achieve their destiny, which as she sees it is to leave this planet for the stars. Her vision of Earth Seed here on Earth sounds to me much like what I imagine life on the Palouse is like. As it's at its most beautiful and pure, which I'm sure it's not always, but as it is in my imagination. Throughout Lauren Olamina's journey, she shares her theological message that God has changed to counter Jared's message of fascism and destruction. Her belief that God is a change, that change is a concept, and that to accept the future, you must accept change, is one I find particularly relevant. One of the passages she writes in the book says this: "Any change may bear seeds of benefit. Seek them out. Any change may bear seeds of harm. Beware. God is infinitely malleable. God is change." Along the road to her destiny, she picks up her followers, and mostly she acquires followers through kindness, saving people from violence and theft, allowing them to join her for safety in numbers. Never pressing her theology, she talks about it slowly to people, allowing them to ask questions, and she slowly wins over her converts. And some of the people, like many Unitarians, I think, come along saying, I don't know if this is really for me, I don't know if I really believe what you're saying, but I like the message enough and I like these people and I'm going to come along for the ride. Octavia Butler explains, "Religion is everywhere." This is Octavia Butler's words. "There are no human societies without it, whether they acknowledge it as a religion or not. And so I thought religion might be an answer as well as, in some cases, a problem. And so, for instance, in the parable of the sower and parable of the talents, it's both. So I have people who are bringing America to a kind of fascism because their religion is the only one they're willing to tolerate. And on the other hand, I have people who are saying, well, here's another religion. And here are some verses that can help us to think in a different way. And here is a destination that isn't something that we have to wait for after we die." It's a very earthbound theology. While we may see her idea of the purpose of Earth Seed is to take root in the stars as far-fetched, it's less far-fetched than saying the purpose of all life is to get to heaven. It's a very, not earthbound, but a very universe-bound theology. It's a very this-worldly theology. So here we are in an America finding its way again after fascism, still in the effects of pandemic, and that message, God is change, I find enormously helpful and hopeful. We will need to embrace change as we move as individuals and congregations into the new realities of the world after this time. We are not going back to the way things were before. In a very literal way, you are not all going back into the same church you came out of. But figuratively too, it's too late for that. We are going forward into a changed world. At my church, we've experienced quite a bit of change this year. We came back into church out of a time online. Just looking at our worship service alone, just this alone, it seemed to shift almost monthly or bi-monthly. It changed constantly. We started our year with worship services outside and online, and then in November, we switched to being in the sanctuary with distancing and masks, plus online. Then in January, with the Omicron wave, we went back online, and then in February, we moved back into our fellowship hall briefly because the sanctuary was under some construction with our new technology. Then we moved back into our sanctuary, but with new technology in place. And then in April, we changed some of our social distancing guidelines, still learning new technology that was still developing. And with our tech, it has been a struggle week in and week out to make hybrid worship work as our technological landscape shifted. Now, over here, on the other side of the country, maybe you have experienced less change than that this year, but you're about to experience a whole lot more of it all at once as you return to a new and changed and different church building. Churches all over the country are experiencing different challenges than ever before, and our ministers, I know your minister has been, turning on a dime, as our lay leaders are as well, making things work as we face this new world. And so worship here is a microcosm example for all the change that we've experienced in our life, because of course the same thing is happening in individual lives. We have the Great Resignation happening in America, where people are changing their employment as they reconsider our lives. Change. Change is our constant. God is change. In Octavia Butler's books, Lauren Olamina is a hopeful figure, a figure who gives us the example of a new start, a new destiny, after destruction, after chaos, after violence and brutality. Her theology that God is change brings together Buddhism and process theology into something new for a new age. In a journal titled Fear and the Spiritual Realism of Octavia Butler's Earthseed, science fiction writer Philip Joss writes, God is change is an invitation to respond to fear with creativity, productivity, and compassion. This is possible, as Lauren's experiences have taught her, among those willing to learn from all that they love or hate, need or fear, and among those willing to fully acknowledge and accept suffering and struggle as an inevitable companion to love and happiness. As William Blake said, joy and woe are woven fine. Just as the message, God is change, is a response to fear in Parable of the Sower. In my other favorite dystopia, Station 11, we get a similar response to fear. At one point in that book, one of the traveling symphony members is in the hands of a villain, and she wishes she could speak to one of the other members. In her mind, she's imagining this. She says if she could, she would say this, quote, "We traveled so far, and your friendship meant everything. It was very difficult, but there were moments of beauty. Everything ends, and I am not afraid." And indeed, these novels tell us to not be afraid. We don't know what the future will bring. The shape of everything to come is unpredictable still, but there are moments of beauty and hope and friendship that mean everything. And so here in religious community, we shape and build that connection, that friendship, and that hope as we live through the turmoil and shape the change that we envision to bend the arc of the universe towards justice. Rather than scaring us, rather than being horror movies and books, dystopias give us hope. They tell us that we can survive. We can survive anything, any government, any ecological disaster, any invasion. They tell us that humanity will hold together, that good people will rise up and they will build society again, and that love and friendship are always present. Dystopias tell us that we have inherent worth and dignity worth protecting and fighting for, and that even in the bleakest of times, others will join us in that fight. And most of all, they tell us that this change, this constant, persistent change, this change that we live in right now and our ever-shifting world is experiencing, it is holy. It is not something to fight, but to become one with and to shape and bend towards the future we imagine. Whatever themes you might look for, whatever ways to connect it to our faith and our causes, I think you can find them in dystopian novels. But of all that you will find in dystopia, the most important things, I think, are hope, meaning, beauty, purpose. And because of that, while it still may be the end of the world as we know it, this is why I feel fine. Beauty abounds. Hope springs eternal. There is always dawn after the darkest night. No matter what happens, humanity will create symphonies. God is change. We are Earthseed. May it be so. Our next hymn is Woyaya. Please join along on mute.
we are going. Heaven knows where we are going, but we know within. And we will get there. Heaven knows how we will get there, but we know we will. It will be hard, we know, and the road will be muddy and rough, but we'll get there. Heaven knows how we will get there, but we know we will. Oh yeah, yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. We are going. Heaven knows where we are going, but we know within. And we will get there. Heaven knows how we will get there, but we know we will. Oh yeah, yeah. 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 Oh yeah,
Our closing words are again by Sean Parker Dennison, titled P.S. Dear ones, we almost forgot. It is important to remember this world is ending. We cannot stop it. And only if we find that we are the same, angel and human, only if we find our common hope will it begin again.
We extinguish this chalice that it might glow gently in our hearts. May it light our paths as we leave this place. May it guide our way until we are together again.
Dearest Earthseed members of the Palouse, let us go in peace, bending the arc towards justice, shaping the change that is to come, sharing love and spreading the seeds of it everywhere. Amen. Blessed be.